It's good to welcome Tevi Troy on this podcast once again. Last time he was on the show, we discussed the great columnist William Safire, and now we're discussing his latest published book, The Power and the Money: The Epic Clashes Between Commanders in Chief and Titans of Industry. So, Tevi, welcome to the show once again. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, tell me about why this book is written.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a presidential historian. I also worked in the White House, so my brand is presidents. I've written now 5 books on the presidency. This is my fifth one. And in each one, I'm trying to address a certain issue. The issue is presidents and blank. The blank is something that nobody else has covered before, and it's interesting about the presidency. Now, when you come to the presidency, it seems like everything has been covered. Presidents in sports, presidents in pets, presidents in food, presidents in sex. So I was trying to find something new. And what I saw, especially in this era, is that CEOs are really the celebrities of our current day. And so I said, what about looking at presidents and CEOs? Nobody has ever covered that before. And then the second aspect of my presidents in blank is that it has to be something that speaks to our current moment. And business is at the top of mind these days. Both Democrats and Republicans seem to dislike business, but at the same time, you have businessmen dominating Trump's cabinet and Trump's advisors. So it seemed to me that all these things came together and led to this idea of making this book called The Power and the Money. And a lot of people, you can't plan the timing of books, but a lot of people have commented to me on how good the timing has been. And The Economist and The Week have named it one of the best books of the year.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So, you also mentioned to me that you've relocated from the Bipartisan Policy Center to the Ronald Reagan Institute.
That's right. I'm at the Ronald Reagan Institute now, and it's a great place to be. I really enjoy it. Roger Zakheim is the head of the institute and a terrific guy. He and I co-authored a piece recently on Ronald Reagan and what he did in terms of trying to get the hostages out in 1980. And I talk about some of the parallels. Roger and I together talk about some of the parallels between the situation then in 1980 with the Iranian hostages and now with the Hamas held hostages. Remember, there are American hostages among those hostages. And Hamas, we should say, is Iran backed. So there is some linkage there as well. And hopefully the situation will end again with those hostages being released by Inauguration Day, if not sooner.
Of course, yes. And speaking of Ronald Reagan, have you seen the new movie with Dennis Quaid? Yep. What do you
I
think?
really want to, but I have not yet seen it.
Uh,
It is on my list.
right. So, since the subject of the book is presidents and CEOs, tell me about the famous CEOs that Reagan had to face during his administration.
Oh, well, Reagan, I think, was one of the best at working with CEOs. He had a number of CEOs who would come by the White House and talk to him. Lee Iacocca would come by and visit. Jack Welch came and visited. Lou Wasserman, who was a Hollywood mogul, was friends with him and close to him and would advise him on a number of matters. So Reagan did have CEOs traipsing in and out of the White House, not unlike what it seems like Trump is going to be having. Reagan would listen to the CEOs on occasion, but he also would not listen. So there's one story I tell in the book of Lee Iacocca, who, after starting out as a kind of anti-regulation, pro-free market business executive at Ford, once he saw the problems that the auto industry was having and he went to Chrysler, suddenly he was a government interventionist and he wanted tariffs and he wanted bailouts. And he would go to the Reagan administration with these kinds of ideas. They were antithetical to Reagan's approach. And one time when he wanted to impose a gas tax to pay for highways, Reagan said to him no. And when Iacocca pressed him on the point, Reagan said that his pollsters had explained that if there were a new gas tax imposed, every time consumers would fill up their gas tanks, they would say, "Oh, this is Reagan who put it on me." And then he said, after rejecting Iacocca's idea, he said, "And that is why I'm on this side of the desk and you're on that side."
So, since Donald Trump is returning to the presidency, I wondered to what extent will he run the country the same way as the CEO runs the company?
Well, it's a good question because the fact of the matter is you can't run this country the way a CEO runs things. Jack Welch who was CEO of GE for many years, a very successful CEO, one a lot of people modeled themselves after, someone that Trump actually admired and was friends with. He was asked multiple times to join government, to become a cabinet member, and he always said no, because you can't do the things in government that you can do as a CEO. One of the things GE was famous for was getting rid of its lowest performing employees every single year. If you were at the bottom ranking of the employees, every year you were out. And you can't do that in the federal government. You can't just go to the Department of Labor and say, okay, top bottom 10 lowest performers, you're all out. It just doesn't work that way. You have civil service protections, Congress would get in the way, and you have an unwieldy board of 535 people, the 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. So you can't run things like a CEO. That said, Trump does take more of a CEO approach. He's more decisive in some ways. He's willing to fire people, which Biden wasn't willing to do. I think that was a mistake on Biden's part. I think Biden did not get accountability from his people by being unwilling to fire. At the same time, Trump probably fired too many people. You have to have some kind of limits on the number of people you're going to fire, or you won't get loyalty and you'll have other challenges. So I think there will be some CEO aspects of what Trump does, but you can't run the government just like a CEO.
I'd like to refer to another CEO who attempted to run for the presidency, and that being Ross Perot. Um, so I think reflecting on his 1992 campaign, what are some of the things that he may have gotten right?
Well, I think Ross Perot is definitely right to talk about the deficit, and it's a lot worse now than it was when Perot was complaining about it. Now we're looking at 35 trillion in debt and something like a $3 trillion, maybe even $4 trillion sometimes annual deficit, which is just unsustainable. So I think Perot was right to do about that. He also mastered plain speak to the American people, and I think that is something that Trump has worked with. But I think Trump also looked to the Perot model and said this guy was as successful a third party candidate as we have had in the last half century. And he got, even though he got 19% of the votes, he got zero electoral votes. And I think that Trump said, there's no way you can do this as an independent, as a third party. He said, I'm going to have to take over one of the major parties. And structurally, even though in some ways he had more affiliations with Democrats in his time in New York, there was no way to take over the Democratic Party because of the special interests that kind of run the show there. But he did see a gap in the more free-for-all and the freewheeling process that is the Republican primaries. And he thought if he could dominate on the debate stage and use his name recognition and his humor, frankly, that he could actually take over the Republican Party. And he was successfully able to do it. And he's had the Republican nomination 3 times consecutively. Nobody's done that. Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee 3 times, but not consecutively. Trump's the only person who's had it 3 times consecutively, which means he's been able to put his stamp on the party for over a decade now.
Yes, and since I've mentioned, I'm doing my master's on William Jennings Bryan in 1896. Bryan was also nominated 3 times by his party, but yeah, not consecutively. No,
Well, no, I mean, and Bryan wasn't a Republican. So
that's it.
Franklin Roosevelt got it 4 times as a Democrat. But I'm saying in the Republican Party, which I think is tougher to stay on top of. I mean, maybe it's easier to climb the pole in the Republican Party, but once they're there, it's harder to stay on top. And so obviously Roosevelt did it more times. William Jennings Bryan did it 3 times on the Democratic side. But in the Republican Party, Trump's the only person to have it 3 consecutive times.
Yes. Let's talk about some of the CEOs that Donald Trump will be working with. The obvious one that comes up is Elon Musk. So how would you assess this close relationship that Musk has with Donald?
Well, Musk is super interesting in that he's been a Democrat his whole life. And in fact, he supported Obama in 12, Hillary in 16, Joe Biden in 2020. And uh, it's in 2024 when he supported Trump is the first time he's backed a Republican for president in his adult life. And the other thing that's interesting is that he became a billionaire in part because of working with the federal government. Obama's green car subsidies led to the rise of Tesla, and Obama went to visit SpaceX, which helped put that company on the Mattering map. So government really was very beneficial to the rise of Musk. But that said, the Democrats, which are more the party of government, they turned on him and they turned on him hard when he started complaining about woke stuff, but also especially when he took over Twitter and he tried to make it a more free speech place. And interestingly, I just heard an analysis by Greg Lukianoff from FIRE, the Foundation on Individual Rights and Expression, the pro free speech thing, and they say that despite what you hear, that Twitter is now a more free speech platform under Musk. And like I trust them on this. They're more neutral observers on this question. So Musk has the government backing him, was formerly a Democrat, but he is turned on by the left, and he finds a welcoming arms in the form of Trump. And so I think he and Trump both dislike the woke stuff. Musk calls it the woke mind virus. And so they have a lot of alignment on many issues. They're also both big celebrities. You know, Kamala Harris would campaign with people like Cardi B. And frankly, people in my generation, we don't even know who Cardi B is. It doesn't mean anything to us if you're campaigning with Cardi B. But everybody knows who Elon Musk is. And so I think by going with these CEO celebrities, Trump tapped into something that the CEO celebrities are actually bigger names than some of the Hollywood and music celebrities who, in our disaggregated culture, are only known by a slice of the electorate.
Yes. And I think for the longest time, Republicans have always had like a celebrity envy with Democrats because most celebrities go to the DNC rather than the RNC. So perhaps Elon might be a balancing force.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely true. And if you think about it, on this in the last campaign, when Musk would show up with Trump, he would get huge people coming to see him. I mean, he was a real celebrity but he's not a traditional celebrity in the way that, I don't know, Cary Grant was in a previous generation. But I think his celebrity status definitely helped Trump on the campaign trail.
Now, another less obvious example is Linda McMahon, who served as the CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment. She's been tapped by Donald Trump as the Secretary of Education, potential nominee and such. I believe she previously worked with him as the head of the SBA, Small Business Association.
Yep.
So I wonder, will the confirmation process mention the fact that Linda's husband, Vince McMahon, is, embroiled in all these sex scandals, and will that stop her in her tracks?
Hmm. I gotta say, I don't know because I was unaware of Vince McMahon's sex scandals. It's hard enough to keep track of the sex scandals of the people who are actually nominated, but to
Yeah.
keep track of the sex scandals of the spouses of those nominated is maybe beyond what I've been able to follow.
Okay. Speaking of CEOs, I'm sure if you're on the internet long enough, a CEO of a health insurance firm was murdered, and
Yeah,
people
it's
are
terrible.
lionizing the alleged murderer. So apparently, being a CEO does carry its risk. So I wonder, why is it that, well, CEOs in particular, in general, and CEOs of health insurance companies get such a bad rap that, this absurdity happened.
Well, it's worse than absurdity. It's a tragedy, and it's not new. I mean, John D. Rockefeller had times when he would sleep with a revolver under his pillow because he was scared of the backlash against him and the trusts. When you'll find this interesting, when President McKinley was assassinated, Rockefeller's people thought this was part of a larger plot, and they had the bodyguards around Rockefeller's estate doubled to make sure that he would be safe. So it's not new that CEOs have attracted the ire of some people in this country, particularly on the anti-corporate left. But it should have been this horrible assassination of Brian Thompson should have been met with universal revulsion. And the fact that anybody thinks that there's anything to praise about this awful killer is really terrible and speaks to some of the challenges we have in our society where people are focused on who the wrong villains are. The commentator and friend of mine, Scott Jennings on CNN, he said this is very simple, folks, and he held up two pictures. One picture was of Luigi, the assassinator of Brian Thompson. He said bad guy, And then he showed a picture of Daniel Penny, who rescued that subway car from this crazed Michael Jackson impersonator who was threatening people's lives and telling them he was going to kill them, and showed up the Penny picture and said, "Good guy." And people have a blinkered sense of morality these days, and we need people to kind of get us back on the straight and narrow.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. So, from your historical exploration of presidents and CEOs, do you conclude that corporations, the CEO, do they thrive more in a laissez-faire economy or a regulated one?
That is a really good question, and it's really at the heart of the book, the Power and the Money. In the book, I talk about how when Rockefeller was a CEO, he operated in what I call the blank slate. Very few government regulations, very few regulatory bodies, very few pieces of legislation that could affect the CEOs. Even though Ulysses S. Grant criticized the trusts back when he was president, uh, there was nothing he could do about it because there were no federal rules at the time in place. And then over time, we've had a more regulated economy. It's now a heavily regulated economy. And in some ways, CEOs do complain about regulations. But at the same time, they're also a barrier to entry for younger, smaller, more entrepreneurial, more innovative firms. And that barrier to entry means that sometimes big companies like the regulatory environment. And whenever you hear legislators say, we should regulate this or we should regulate that, sometimes you'll hear the biggest companies say, yes, we agree. We're going to sit at the table with you and decide what the regulations are. And those regulations inevitably help the bigger companies and make it harder for the smaller companies to comply. And remember, complexity is a subsidy. So if you are a bigger company and you have teams of lawyers and lobbyists and compliance officials, it's a heck of a lot easier for you to comply with all the many, many federal regulations than if you're a smaller startup that's just trying to figure out how to make a go of it in this very competitive government, in this very competitive, mostly free market economy.
And I think this is a statement that you agree that the the American market is considerably less free than it was in the 19th century, the time when Rockefeller started his empire. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but I'm not sure we'd want to go back to that either. I mean, that was I would say there was not enough regulation. When Rockefeller created his empire, he called his company Standard Oil because he was creating a standard for petroleum products. At the time, the products were unreliable, they were combustible. You didn't know what you were going to get when you bought something. But Rockefeller said, "My products are standard. You can trust the Rockefeller standard." And in doing so, he formed a type of self-regulation. He was using private sector regulation to say, you can trust my products. And, that's a good way to do things in some areas, but we don't want to do that, let's say, in medicine. So that's why we have an FDA. So I think we do need some regulation. That said, we have way too many regulations right now, and we need to pare them back to get to a more manageable system.
I think one of the I guess blind spots that legislators and regulators often have about corporations is that they don't tend to last forever. I think after all, there's no Standard Oil anymore, and I can remember that IBM failed to keep up with the times, and something like VHS. Um, they do not exist anymore. They're brands that were very popular back in the day. They just collapsed. So, um, from your point of view, why do corporations have you know such a short, or at least not as long a lifespan as people think they are?
Well, because it's a very competitive environment, I think is one thing, and I think that's a good thing. And technologies evolve. If you look at the S&P 500 or the Fortune 500, year in, year out, so from 2017, 18, 19, 20, those companies are largely the same. But if you look over a longer time horizon, let's say you go back to 1990 and then 1960, you'll see massive turnover in the Fortune 500. I mentioned GE earlier. It was a colossus for a long time until it wasn't, until their model stopped working. And so in a competitive environment, in a free market, that's what we want to see. We want to see some companies rise, some companies fall. And, look, a company like NVIDIA that very few people heard of 2 years ago is now a multi-trillion-dollar company. And, and they're providing a real service. I mean, we need these AI chips, and they're the only ones who can provide them, or at least the ones who can provide them in enough numbers. So uh, that's just the way it is. I think government sometimes contributes because government can intervene to knock some companies out of the running or destroy the company's business models. But in other ways, government kind of props up certain companies, as I said earlier, with the regulatory environment that makes it harder for those entrepreneurs to emerge, but it doesn't make it impossible. And that's the great thing about the American system, that when these entrepreneurs emerge, then you can shake up things. So if you look at the big stocks, the so-called FANG stocks, the Facebook, which is no longer called Facebook, and Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. Those companies did not exist 30 years ago, and now they dominate the S&P 500. And so that churn, that creative destruction, is what makes a free market system go. Even if there's disruption in it, it is better than all the other options.
Yes. And I think it is something for I think conservatives to think about too, is that most conservatives support the free market, but I'm sure they understand that it is an inherently disruptive mechanism for regulating economy and the social life.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if most conservatives support the free market. What you see, at least in politicians, is there's two types of Republicans. There's pro-business Republicans and there's pro-market Republicans, and those are different things. And a pro-market politician wants to see a fair system with equal rules, and let the best business win. Where these pro-business people are often willing to favor certain subsidies for different client actors, and I think that's a less fair system and doesn't give everybody an equal shake.
So I've heard a lot of Gilded Age analogies. I've read in the same pages of the City Journal, which I found your William Safire piece. Troy Senik
Great
wrote.
magazine. Love City Journal. I also love Troy Senik, who was a speechwriter in the Bush White House where I worked, and I got to know him. He's a very talented guy.
Yeah, yes, I use his Cleveland biography as research material for my thesis at the moment. But
Yeah, that
he
was a terrific biography by Troy Senik,
it
and
is,
I
yes.
viewed it very favorably in the Free Beacon,
Mhm.
and it's definitely worth reading.
Um, so he wrote a piece in City Journal, great prestigious magazine, that we're living basically in Gilded Age times. There are so many parallels to count. So I wonder, what do you think of his assessment?
Yeah, look, as a historian, it's a common thing. You find parallels to other eras. I do it all the time. But even though there's always parallels, there's always also differences. I mean, look, we didn't have iPhones in the Gilded Age. I mean, it's just not the same thing. And you can point out the parallels, and it's interesting and instructive and informative, but it's not predictive. Just because certain things happen in the Gilded Age doesn't mean they're going to happen today.
Let's talk about another CEO, that being Rupert Murdoch. I remember in the run up to 2016, a lot of discourse has been focused on how this Australian media titan has been able to quote unquote manipulate politics from Brexit because he owned a lot of big British newspapers to the election of Donald Trump because he is the also the owner of Wall Street Journal and Fox. So what do you suppose his impact on American conservatism is?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Murdoch is a really interesting character in The Power and the Money. He first appears when he has a meeting with John F. Kennedy in the White House back in the early 1960s. So he's been on the scene for a long time. He dominates media in Australia, then he moves to England, and he gets very powerful in media there. And then he sees the big opportunity in America, and he becomes powerful in both newspapers and television stations. He sees that opportunity for a new network in Fox, and then he sees the opening for a new news media channel, a new news channel in Fox News, which is still the most profitable news division or the news channel that we have. And so he has a lot of grand vision. Uh, I think Fox News gave an outlet to conservatives at a time when they didn't have any in the 1990s, and now there are many outlets out there, so it's not just a Fox world. But the mind meld between Fox and Trump is also something that's very interesting. It said that the best way to get a message to Trump is to appear on Fox and say something, and then he'll hear it. And especially if you can appear more than once and say it multiple times, it's even more likely that he'll hear it. So a big impact on conservatives. And then also you can't forget that Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, which has the most important and influential op-ed page, not only in the conservative world, but in period. If you want to get a message out, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is the best place to do it. So Murdoch hugely influential in many ways, and unsurprisingly, a lot of presidents have set their sights on him, either to woo him, as some of the Republicans have done, or to go after him, as some of the Democrats have done. And Obama even had an anti-Fox, anti-Murdoch war room that was in effect. So yeah, Murdoch is a big part of the story in The Power of the Money.
Tell me about the CEOs who are currently against Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a really good question because I could have more easily told you that in 2017 than I can in 20 going into 2025 because the CEOs were much more vocal in their opposition to Trump back then, and now they're trying to be more accommodating. We saw that Amazon and Facebook gave big donations to the Trump inauguration. That many CEOs are calling Trump and trying to befriend him. One story I heard was that Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, who's always been very skillful at getting to know politicians on both sides of the aisle, has been reaching out to Trump and has largely been rebuffed to some extent. So, so, so it'd be hard pressed to find a CEO who's really out there saying, I'm going to take down Donald Trump. They're just not doing that anymore. And it wouldn't be in the interest of their shareholders. So CEOs are less quiet. And that's one of the reasons why Trump said in 2017, everybody was against me. And now people are trying to be my friend. And Trump likes that.
One of the guys that Donald Trump is currently working with too is Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm not sure if he counts as a CEO or not, but he has a
Sure.
book.
I mean, he was CEO of a biotech company.
Yes. Okay, then he does count as a CEO. He wrote a book called Woke Capitalism. I believe it came
Yes.
out in 2019, 2020, in which he remarked that after the financial recession of 08, 09, corporations, CEOs are looking to rebuild their image and in some ways to prove that capitalism is on the side of the just. So they bring out a new brand campaign that associates themselves with the ideas of woke and gender ideology and so on and so forth. Is was that like truly the intentions of the CEOs? And also, I suppose the broader question would be, how does the Great Recession impact the perspective of CEOs amongst Americans?
Yeah, Ramaswamy's book, which I read, and it's very interesting. It is a more cynical take. What it says is that these CEOs have their companies embrace the woke ideology as a distraction to distract liberal regulators and politicians from going after their companies and their business models and saying, look, we have DEI, we have CRT, don't bother us, go bother someone else. And it works to some degree, but there's also backlash. Employees often don't like it. The Republicans certainly don't like it. And it doesn't really get the Democratic politicians off your trail. Elizabeth Warren doesn't like corporations, regardless of whether they have woke policies. And so I think it was an interesting strategy, but a failed one.
So throughout history, which party was more favorable to corporate and business interests, the Republicans or the Democrats?
Well, I would say largely the Republicans have been seen as the party of big business, but in recent years, uh, Democrats have been cozying up to big business, have been getting money from big business. And big business has increasingly been alienating Republicans, largely with these woke policies, but also by being an unreliable ally. I think a watershed moment came in 2009 when pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies, went and backed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, if you will, and the uh, the Republicans said, well, wait a minute, we've been defending you from Democratic attacks for 20 years, and now you side with the Democrats when we are trying to oppose this bill. And so I think that opened a lot of Republican eyes. When I served in government, Elaine Chao was the Secretary of Labor. I worked under her, and she was one of my mentors. And she said, you can't trust these business guys in a foxhole. They're just not going to be with you if the noise, if the attention gets too great, and if it's not necessarily in their corporate interests. And so I think Republicans are understandably wary of business to some degree.
I remember when Bernie Sanders, senator of Vermont, ran in 2016 and 2020, and he would complain a lot about big donors, and he would assume that big donors often donate to the Republicans. Um,
Yeah, tell
and
that to George Soros.
yeah, he's from the city that I lived, so yeah, we know him all too well. Um, but I think his complaints started with the Citizens United versus FEC decision, where I think many people on the left wing thinks that it opened the door to unlimited campaign financing. So, reflecting on that decision some years later, has it done that effect, or has it changed the way that presidential or any political campaigns are organized?
Look, the truth is that in politics, money finds a way. However you write the rules, the people who want to donate money are going to find ways to donate money. So if you write the rules so that they can do it through super PACs, they'll do it through super PACs. If you do it through individual contributions, they'll do it through individual contributions. And so you can't really write the perfect rule. And what happened there is that now a lot of this money comes through super PACs. Some of this comes through places where you don't have to disclose donors. It is harder, perhaps, to donate money directly to a candidate, and there's more limits on that. But these outside groups get a lot of money, and they get a lot of money from not only corporations, but wealthy individuals. There's a lot of dark money out there. And so the more you try and regulate it, the more people find ways to skirt the system, or at least adhere to the regulations, but in ways that perhaps were not intended. I mean, I'm for fewer limits and more transparency. You want to give money? Let's just let people know what you're giving, and then don't put the limits on, but everyone will know what you're doing.
Um, I believe what happened to Mayor Eric Adams, it's well, I'm not sure if it's in the news anymore, but one of the mm, one of the accusations is that he takes quote unquote bribes in the forms of gifts from Turkish officials. So to what extent should we be concerned about foreign contributions to American politics?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's really disturbing. You have this Swiss billionaire who gives a lot of money to left-wing causes, and mostly through dark money. So yeah, I mean, it is a concern. It should be Americans who are giving money for the most part. The Adams thing is strange and disturbing, given that Turkey has not been a U.S. ally in recent years, and a country that we do have to worry about. So I am very wary of what's going on with Adams. But Adams was doing it through airline gifts and other things that I would say are somewhat harder to track. But as I said, money always finds a way. I quote the famous Mark Hanna in the book, who is the as you know, the chairman of the Republican National Committee back in the day, in the period that you study, 1890s, early 1900s. And he said there's three things important in politics. The first is money, and I forgot the other two. So money is always going to be important in politics, and money is always going to find a way.
Yes, and for those who do not know, Hanna was instrumental in McKinley's 1896 victory. He basically sold the American public this image of McKinley. So, McKinley didn't have to travel around the country like Bryan to give speeches and whatnot. He could just stay home. It's called the Front Porch Campaign for a reason, and I think Hanna was instrumental in making that work.
He also hated Teddy Roosevelt and was unhappy about Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency and thought about running against him in 1904, but he died and never made that run.
Since you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, I think his stance towards business are diametrically opposed to McKinley in
Yeah, you'd
some
say
ways.
that.
He's best remembered today for trust busting. So I think for those who need a historical refresher, what were trusts and how did Teddy bust them?
The trusts were these I guess, agreements between large companies of most famously with the railroads, but also with the oil companies like John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and you would have the railroad companies would get together, they would collude on prices, and then they would also collude on the the fares. So Standard Oil would get a cheaper fare than other petroleum companies in passing on their in distributing their products, and other companies didn't have as quite a fair shake. And so the trusts were also very powerful, and they gave a lot of money to politicians, sometimes bribery, sometimes just direct contributions. And there was a lot of unhappiness by the American people with these trusts. And Roosevelt used some of these new tools that I was talking about, including the Sherman Antitrust Act. He created something called the Bureau of Corporations, and he went after the trusts and tried to break them up. He was successful in breaking up Standard Oil, which we talked about earlier, but only after he was president, when the Supreme Court ruled on it in 1911, once Taft was now president. But a company may be broken up, but it doesn't necessarily go away. And so I tell the story in the book about John D. Rockefeller, who's now retired from the company, learns on the golf course that Standard Oil has been broken up, that the Supreme Court said it was okay to do that. And he looks at the priest with whom he is playing, and he gives him 3 words of brilliant financial advice. He says, buy Standard Oil, which is something you wouldn't have expected at that moment, which is in some ways a low for the company. But what happened was Standard Oil was indeed broken up, but it was broken up into Chevron and Exxon and Mobil and BP and all these now multi-billion-dollar companies that are hugely successful and profitable. And if you had bought Standard Oil at that moment, you would have had shares of stock in all those very worthwhile, very valuable companies.
And is it solely because of new regulations that we don't see another Standard Oil, or it's just that business incentives prevents them from ever uniting once again?
I think it's hard to have a such a big monopoly in a well-established field, and that's why it's easier to create a monopoly in something new. So that's why you saw Standard Oil in the new field of petroleum products, Microsoft in the new field of personal computing and software, especially software that would run these personal computers. And then you start to have the social media companies, Facebook dominant there. Even today with AI chips, relatively new world, and that's why NVIDIA is able to be so dominant. So I just think newness allows for consolidation in a way that that more mature industries you don't have it as much.
So how can mergers succeed and fail? I'm thinking about the AOL Time Warner acquisition, which everybody thought was a failure. So why did that fail while others, I suppose, did not?
Yeah, well, it failed for a number of reasons, AOL Time Warner. First is that the AOL business model wasn't long for the world. And so AOL takes over this revered, longstanding company. And I do talk about the creation of Time and Henry Luce, its founder, in The Power of the Money. But AOL is this upstart, and people don't use dial-up internet anymore. They don't use their AOL. If somebody gives you an AOL email address, they're over 60 years old. So their business model was failing, and it's hard to swallow an enterprise that's bigger and more important. Also, there's a lot of consolidation and challenges in the media industry. The Time and Warner had their ups and downs. And the corporate cultures didn't mesh. So there are a bunch of reasons why that merger failed. And mergers often fail. People see some kind of horizontal or vertical integration, it doesn't always work. And so just merging companies doesn't solve the inherent problems that companies have. Usually, it's not two thriving companies who say, hey, let's merge. It's usually either one or both companies are having problems. And sometimes the merger itself doesn't solve the problems.
And I'm assuming that Time Life did not, the Time Life merger did not work well, I suppose, for Life magazine.
Well, Time created Life.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
Henry Luce creates Time magazine, and he creates Life and Sports Illustrated and all these magazines that were huge at the time, but Life doesn't exist anymore. Sports Illustrated doesn't exist anymore. Time is online only. So these magazines that were so dominant in the mid 20th century are a shadow of their former selves.
I suppose I could still see like printed copies of Time in like airports if I ever visit one. But yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean it's just not. I mean there were 16 million subscribers to these Time Life magazines back in the day. It's just not the case anymore.
Yeah. So
So
I
most
guess
people, if they read Time, they're reading it online.
well, speaking of the printing press, tell me a bit about the printing wars between Hearst and Pulitzer and which presidents stood by either one of them.
Right. Well, first of all, that's not covered in my book, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But yeah, it is an important era of American history. You had these so-called yellow journals there, and you had the start of consolidation in the media industry, where you would have these people who would own many papers across many different cities, and they had different visions. And I think that's what was going on with Hearst and Pulitzer, and and that it was in that era that Henry Luce saw the opportunity for some kind of national news platform, and that's where Time came. So it wasn't just a bunch of local papers; he brought his own national vision in.
And not to press on this too much, but is it true that Hearst's papers and his so-called yellow journalism prompted Roosevelt or McKinley to start the Spanish-American War?
Well, it was McKinley. Roosevelt was actually just the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, although it did help propel him to his later positions because he was a hero in that war, was the head of the Rough Riders, and that led to him becoming governor of New York. As governor of New York, he alienated the trusts and the Rockefellers, and they said, "Let's get him out of the way by making him vice president." And then that backfired when McKinley died and or was murdered, and then he became president. But yeah, the yellow journalism did kind of increase the ire of Americans about the Spanish, and the obvious precursor to the war was the blowing up of the Maine, an American ship that was in a harbor in Cuba. But the Maine explosion, which probably was not sabotage, but was probably an accident, uh, I think it just highlighted some of the underlying issues that were going on with Spain and imperialism, and especially imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that war might have happened either way.
Yes. I think those who know film would know that Hearst is an inspiration for the Charles Foster Kane character in the film Citizen Kane, which for an upstart 24-year-old Orson Welles, he created an enduring masterpiece. And I heard that Hearst did not like it. So was it did the movie hit too close to home?
Oh yeah, I mean he Hearst hated the movie and tried to have it suppressed, and didn't want to have any positive reviews or any reviews of it. But it was such a masterpiece that it still endures and is still seen one of the greatest films of all time. And yeah, look, Kane, like Hearst, was a very difficult person, but also very successful. And I think I could see why Hearst didn't like the portrayal.
Which of the CEOs in American history models what it's like to be a CEO?
I mean, I think Rockefeller is in many ways the model that many people look to. Henry Ford, I talk about in the book. I mean, a lot of these people are innovator CEOs. They innovate, they create something new, like Henry Ford created the Model T, which is an automobile that could be driven by an average American. and then he runs his company for decades after that. So he's a model in some ways. Jack Welch was in some ways the paradigmatic CEO of the late 20th century. Uh, and all of those guys are covered in the Power and the Money because all of them had, and this is the key to the book, relationships with multiple presidents that you could track over time.
Yes. I would argue that Ford's more important innovation is not the automobile, but the assembly line. I think that can be applied to all industries.
It is true, and he saw in the assembly line brought a lot of around many things. So first of all, he brought about the $5 day, which was a high wage at the time, but you had to work really hard for that. There were more regular hours. He was a champion of giving people the weekends off because if people didn't have weekends off, they wouldn't have time to drive his cars and they wouldn't buy his cars. So he wanted his workers to be well paid so that they would want to have the money to purchase the vehicles, and he wanted them to have leisure time so that they would have time to use the vehicles.
So I wonder if you count Hollywood executives as CEOs. And
Absolutely. I mentioned Lou Wasserman earlier, but I also have the Warner Brothers are in there. So yeah, Hollywood executives, and you know what I'm trying to get on the Power and the Money is certain key iconic American industries. So media, entertainment, automobiles, they're all part of the American story.
yes, and I think one of the things that irks me about the current Republican discourse is that, they think that Hollywood is just a propaganda machine for the left wing and such. But in reality, I think Hollywood is how the world, including people like myself, know about American culture. And I think it is beneficial for American presidents, left or right, Republican or Democrat, to foster a relationship with the Hollywood people.
Yeah, and if you look at the Power of the Money, especially my chapter on the Warners, they were propagandists too. They were propagandists for a very pro-American vision, anti-Nazi, pro-New Deal, and they really helped Franklin Roosevelt spread his ideas through film. If you look at the 1980s, there were the kind of go-go pro-America movies that Ronald Reagan reveled in. But it is true that in recent years, Hollywood kind of has a dark, woke vision that a lot of people just don't relate to. And it's one of the reasons that movies just aren't resonating to the same degree as they once did. And as long as this woke ideology dominates Hollywood, it's going to be harder to get to really spread that positive vision about America that you're talking about that is so important.
Yes, I'd say so too. I also add that the addition of home video also drives people away from the movies, and of course, the pandemic really hurt the film industry too.
Yeah, but also streaming. Kids today are much more likely to watch a TikTok than to sit and watch a 2-hour movie. YouTube has all kinds of ways to entertain. I mentioned earlier the disaggregation of popular culture. There's no one thing that everybody watches. When I was growing up, everybody watched Happy Days, or in the 1990s, everybody would talk the next day about what happened on Seinfeld. There's no one TV show that everybody watches anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's in some ways is tragic.
I don't know if it's tragic. It's certainly less unifying. We don't feel like we're part of the same nation because we don't watch the same shows anymore. Even shows that the New York Times kind of moons over that they talk about over and over again. Articles like Breaking Bad was dominant in the New York Times coverage, but not even 10 million people were watching the episodes regularly. So these shows that the kind of cultural elites focus on aren't necessarily the shows that regular Americans are watching.
Now, this is something that I can distinctively remember in my lifetime, where when President Obama was elected, social media is seen as a positive force. I think even until the Arab Spring Revolution too. But when Donald Trump was elected, and thanks to the same force, I suppose Facebook for Obama and Twitter for Trump, then social media is seen as something negative. Is it because we happen to know more, or is it just because of partisan divide?
I think partisanship is part of it. The fact that Obama used Facebook was seen as so nice in 2008 and 2012, and then the fact that Trump successfully used Twitter And also Facebook in his 2016 campaign, suddenly people had some problems with the social media companies. But there are also a lot of nefarious impacts of the social media companies, especially kids' obsession with social media, the way TikTok puts out very problematic, very anti-American messages. I mean, you look at TikTok in China and what they're allowed to put out and what they put out in America is very different. I mean, they put out math videos in China and videos about how horrible America is here. So I think ownership issues are part of the problem. uh, Censorship questions. It's not technically censorship if Twitter deplatforms you, and it's not a First Amendment violation, but it certainly feels bad. You're allowed to say what you want, but if you can't have other people say it, you're not really being able to get your message out. So I think the social media companies have a lot to do to kind of repair their image with the American people.
Yes, and of course, since you mentioned TikTok, there was bipartisan legislation to have the company sold to American buyers. So I think it brings us back to the problem having foreign money, so to speak. This time it's in the form of a corporation, and of course the 5G innovations is also being tampered because it has a lot to do with China's influence. So in the choice between a technological innovation and national security, what are we picking?
Um, well, usually technological innovation, but in times of crisis, we pick national security. So after 9/11, national security was winning out. Um, Now there's concern about China, but we're not in a hot war with China. I hope we never are in a hot war with China. Uh, and so thus far, innovation is mostly winning, but people are starting to raise questions, and we'll see how it plays out.
I think here's a potential conflict that someone like Donald Trump and someone like Elon Musk may have is that Tesla factories and assembly lines do exist in China. And I think America has, at least politically, has been so hostile to China lately, and that has been a bipartisan consensus. And in the globalized age, CEOs often wanted to, well, globalize their market share. And how can that be compatible to, well, U.S. national interests?
Yeah, well, on the China front, it's a bit of a two-way street. I think since President Xi has come to town, China has also been much more hostile to the U.S. And look, I'd rather these two countries don't end up in a war. I'd rather that China go back to its modernizing path that we thought might be leading to either, if not full-on democracy, but more freedom. They've receded from that, and they've chosen to uh, make um, make hay with other autocracies. I think it's the bad strategic decision for them, and I don't think it'll win out in the long run. But that's the path that President Xi has chosen. And as long as he is in charge, I think we're looking at, if not full-on conflict, at least competition with China. And I hope that can change. I mean, I remember in the 1980s, there was a lot of concerns about Japan, that we were inevitably going to be fighting with Japan, and now we're allies with Japan. We were allies then, but now that sense of competition with Japan is over. Obviously the Germans were a great enemy at one point, and now the U.S. and Germany are friends. So I hope that with China we can skip the war phase and go straight to friends and allies, hopefully democratic allies.
Since you mentioned yeah, the automotive industry, will the American automobile industry, come back, and will Tesla be a good factor in bringing that comeback?
Yeah, look, Tesla is certainly super interesting. Not only does it incorporate this new technology in terms of the electric cars, but Musk is less inclined to go along with these crippling union contracts that were really the things that destroyed Detroit. And so I think that if the U.S. auto industry is going to be come back and become dominant again, it'll never be as dominant again as the years of the big three in the 50s, let's say. But if it's going to make a recovery, it's going to be because they have to figure out how to get past or through this issue of the crippling labor contracts that are really short-sighted in that they provide all these long-term benefits that the CEOs don't necessarily have to worry about paying in the short term, but in the long term, they're ruinous to the companies.
So finally, I think most Americans, even the ones that are more left inclined, would say that they are against government intervening in their lives, but at the same time, government keeps growing. So why this contradiction?
Yeah, that's a really good question and probably grist for a whole nother podcast. But look, people want safety and security. And because the federal government has so many federal transfer programs, a lot of people feel like they're getting something from the federal government. Now, what we're all getting is the path to ruin because $35 trillion in debt is unsustainable. But everybody wants to keep their piece of the pie. And it's sort of like the contradiction of how everybody hates Congress, but they love their own congressman. So they like what they're getting, but they see the larger picture and they're not happy with it, but they just like what they're getting so much that they're not willing to necessarily always vote according to the larger picture.
Well, on that said, thank you very much, Tevi Troy, for joining the show once again.
Always happy to discuss the power and the money. Thanks so much.
All right, and happy Christmas.
Thank you.